to Wilfred for welcoming us with your music. Wilfred Langmaid is UNB student advocate with UNB Student Affairs and Services. He's also a talented musician who has taken part in UNB Remembers since it began 11 years ago. My name is Michelle McNeil. I'm a proud UNB alumna, and I'm also the executive director of the UNB Associated Alumni. I was raised in the military community. My father served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 35 years, and so it is an honor for me to serve as the MC today for the UNB Remembers ceremony. We really appreciate that each of you has taken the time to be here today for this important event, and I'd also like to welcome our colleagues in St. John. They are gathered in the Hans W. Clone Commons and hosted by Biloela husband Cheyenne Joseph. I would like to acknowledge that UNB stands on unceded and unsurrendered traditional Wolastoqey land. The river that connects our campuses is Wolastoq, along which live Wolastoqey, the people of the beautiful and bountiful river. The lands of Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn, are recognized in a series of peace and friendship treaties to establish an ongoing relationship of peace, friendship, and mutual respect between equal nations. Over the next hour, in honor of National Aboriginal Veterans Day on November 8th and Remembrance Day on November 11th, we will have the honor of hearing stories of 4 New Brunswickers who risked or sacrificed their lives fighting for peace. This ceremony is also a time to reflect on the continued impact of war, the ongoing conflicts in the Ukraine, the Middle East, and throughout Africa. It is a time to remember that while we in Canada have the fortune of living our daily lives in peace, many members of our university community are directly impacted by the cold brutalities of war. I would now like to invite Wolastoq Grand Chief Ron Tremblay of the Wolastoq Grand Council to perform a sacred pipe ceremony. We would ask that there are no photographs taken during the ceremony.
Played Silewan. Spazarul Pesazan and Lewis, Wolastoq Gawnel, Papa Vosvogonum, and a Monson Malonum. Gedawil Gage Archoya good. Genzos of what at Hilligoti did Chibano, Samesnuk, Puskiasnuk, Nagalata Westnuk, and the Lodavaka Moak Chub said the Mouse Alaga. And I'm going to be a lot of welcome Chigi question skik to make what did I Habasi Lumkik the kid I would ski you, and I said I would add that you'd skik to make. And I'm going to be a lot of welcome Muslims we was for those that no misbeating about said. This is a lot that meet like we music is and I said about mouse wagon. Billy Ben Giscock. Greetings. My traditional name is Spazagazet Pesazan, which means Morning Star Burning. That was gifted to me by the late Gwen Bear, who was the elder in residence here at UNB, and my mother. I want to thank them for passing down that beautiful name that comes with a huge responsibility. And I am from the Wolastoq Nation. I'm a citizen of Wolastoq here on our homeland of this beautiful and bountiful place of the river. And I represent the Crow clan through my mother's side and the Wolf clan through my dad's side. And what I said is I wanted to invite the ancestors of our peoples who dwell in the east, the south, the west, and the north to come and be with us today to bring their wisdom, and their guidance, and their powers to heal. And I was thankful for a great Earth Mother for all that she provides for us, that she sustains our lives. She gives us water and food and medicine. And I thank the above world where dwells our grandmother moon, our grandfather sun, our sisters and brothers the stars, and our father sky. And I ask them to come down and be with us today in this special event. And I just want to say a couple of words that my dad served in the Second World War, and he was proud to be a veteran, and there was many men from my community of Tobik, of Negutkuk, who went to Second World War, First World War, Korean War, Vietnam, and they went to secure a place back here for us. And my grandfather, Louis Sapir, went into the First World War, and they all came back. There was only approximately 4 men who never came back to our community from the Second World War. One was a relative, Walter Tremblay. So I want to thank them, all those men and women who served to protect our lands back home here. So I'm going to do a pipe ceremony, and sorry that I'm late, but I took the wrong road walking here. Then I walked way up on top the hill to realize that I went too far and had to ask where this place was. So I'll be doing the pipe ceremony, and what a pipe ceremony is, I bring the balance between the feminine and the masculine beings of all creation. And the stem part of the pipe represents the male, and the stone part represents the female. So that's the balance between life. And if we all observe life, that it creates that beautiful balance between feminine and masculine, and we bring forth all the gratitude for life. And I will be putting seven pinches of tobacco in the pipe, and the 7 is a very sacred like number for us, that it represents the east, the south, the west, the north, the below world, the above world, and the center here. So I'll be blowing out the smoke to pay gratitude for all those directions. And I will light a smudge too of cedar and sage, and to cleanse the pipe before I do the ceremony. And I want to thank you for coming today, and maybe I'll say a few more words later. Thank you.
Thank you, Grand Chief Tremblay. An integral part of our annual UNB Remembers ceremony is storytelling. Today, 3 students from our history department will share the biographies of Black, settler, and Indigenous service people who risked or sacrificed their lives for their country. To begin, I would like to invite Darian Calhoun to share some words about Arthur Paul, a First World War Wolastoqiyik soldier from St. Mary's. Darian comes from Woodstock, New Brunswick. He is in his 2nd year working toward a Master of History, and Darian plans on pursuing a Doctor of Philosophy and History upon completion of his Master's. Welcome, Darian.
Hello everyone, my name is Darian Calhoun and I'm a graduate student at UNB. I am also a mixed Indigenous person with family roots to the Maliseet of Woodstock. My work as a graduate student has mostly entailed the study of Wabanaki Indigenous soldiers who served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. And there's a particular focus on Maliseet and Mi'kmaq case files for that. Today, I will be talking about a man named Arthur Paul, who was born at Sitansisk, also known as the St. Mary's First Nation, on January 6th, 1898. Arthur Paul's military service began on January 3rd, 1917, when he was attested at Fredericton, New Brunswick. Initially, Paul was placed into 236th Battalion, also known as the New Brunswick Kilties, Sir Sam Zone, but he would later be moved to 87th Battalion and finally to the 42nd Battalion. Now the 42nd Battalion is also known as the Royal Highlanders of Canada, and it would go on to become the famed Black Watch of Canada. This particular unit would be crucial to the 100 Days Offensive, for which Canada was heavily involved in. The 100 Days Offensive lasted from August 11th, 1918 until the end of the war. It was a brutal but necessary period to the end of the war. And this is all relevant to Arthur Paul, as in June of 1918, he was transferred from 87th Battalion to 42nd Battalion, which means that he was present with the unit as they progressed through the offensive. Private Arthur Paul and the 42nd Battalion would take part in the Battle of Amiens in August, and from there they would push towards the Hindenburg Line. Paul and his unit would advance towards the Canal du Nord, just on the outskirts of the important supply line at Cambrai. And this particular phase in the offensive would begin on September 27th, 1918, 2 days after the commencement of the Battle of the Canal du Nord. On September 29th, Arthur Paul would be wounded in action, having received a gunshot wound to his left hand. The nature of his wound was quite vicious, as he was subsequently forced to have his first, second, and third fingers amputated off of his left hand. I want to also take a second to point out that UNB's own Milton Gregg was also present with the Royal Canadian Regiment at Canal du Nord, and it was there that Gregg performs the actions for which he would be awarded the Victoria Cross. While the wounds that Milton Gregg and Arthur Paul experienced were different, they both returned to Canada. However, a huge difference is the worlds for which Milton Gregg and Arthur Paul were returning home to. Milton Gregg goes on to become quite established in politics and academia in the years after the war. On the other hand, Arthur Paul would have arguably had a much more difficult time in the post-war period. For many soldiers returning home, the problem comes with reintegration. But what does this process look like for an Indigenous man from Sitansisk, who now also must learn to live with a permanent disability? In conclusion, The point of discussing Arthur Paul alongside Milton Gregg is to simply show that the added difficulties and intricacies that may be present when discussing Indigenous veterans, but it depends on the time period. Additionally, the way we think of and commemorate disabled veterans gets reworked when we also take into account that Indigenous disabled veterans become even further marginalized within that group. It works to provide more questions, such as what kinds of complications Arthur may have faced if he was to inquire about disability and pension benefits. Overall, commemoration for Indigenous veterans has been constantly changing, as previously commemoration was largely focused on Indigenous soldiers who were awarded medals or they were killed in action. And the space that we are gathered at today and the land that we sit on was one that was exclusive to Indigenous people like Arthur Paul, and the fact that he is not awarded a medal or killed in action reflects the lack of commemoration. However, by talking about his story, I hope to open the pathway for more stories like Paul's to be brought into the light and to get people thinking differently about how we commemorate soldiers in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Darian. Mackenzie Smith will now speak about Lieutenant Donald Moffett, a UNB alumnus who was killed in action during the Second World War. Mackenzie comes from Fredericton. She is a second-year master's student in history and has served as a research assistant at the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society since 2018. Like Darian, she plans on undertaking a PhD in history when she's finished her master's. Welcome, Mackenzie.
Hello everyone. I'm going to tell you the story today of UNB alumnus and settler, Lieutenant Donald Wallace Moffett. Lieutenant Donald Wallace Moffett was born on May 19, 1921 in Sussex, New Brunswick. Moffett grew up in Sussex with his parents, Sterling and Florence Moffett, as well as his younger brother, David. Prior to his enlistment, Moffett was a university student. After graduating from Sussex High School, he had the privilege to be able to attend university that many others were denied. Moffett attended the University of New Brunswick for a year where he was enrolled in the forestry program. After this year, Moffett transferred to Mount Allison University and enrolled in the Bachelor of Arts with a major of English. And it is at this time that he served with the Mount Allison University's Militia Commanding Officer Training Contingent for 2 years. In his service with the contingent, Moffett rose to the rank of second lieutenant. Ultimately, after these 2 years at Mount Allison and with the contingent, he left university to enlist with the active force on October 2nd, 1941. After only a month of training in both Fredericton and Aldershot, Moffett was quickly promoted to the rank of lieutenant. After his promotion, Moffett completed more training at Camp Utopia in New Brunswick, including a driving and maintenance course. It was during this training that he was interviewed for his personnel selection record. Personnel selection records can offer us a little bit into a Second World War soldier's personality, or at least their perception of the examining officer. The examining officer for Moffett was Lieutenant D.E. Allen, who described Moffett as a man with superior intelligence and learning capacity with a, quote, smart soldierly appearance. Allen was further described that Moffett had an interest in all sports, like swimming and hunting, but that his main hobby was reading. Over a full year after his enlistment, in December 1942, Moffett was transferred overseas to the UK. Moffett served with the Cape Breton Highlanders, the 7th Canadian Infantry Reserve Unit, and the Carleton and York Regiment intermittently throughout 1943 and 1944. Moffett also participated in several courses overseas, such as a flamethrower course, a chemical warfare course, and 2 physical training courses. The extent to which this man received training is indicative of what it took to become a mid-level leader in these types of units. Moffett was transferred from the UK to the Mediterranean Theatre of War in February of 1944. Moffett served with his final unit, the Carleton and York Regiment, in May of 1944. The month of May was spent in preparation and advancing towards the Hitler Line in Italy as part of the larger Allied spring offensive codenamed Operation Diadem. The goal of the Carleton and Yorks were to pierce the last piece of the German fortified line between the 22nd and the 23rd of May. In the morning of May 22nd, D Company of the Carleton and Yorks had begun their advance to break the line. Lieutenant Moffett was commanding a platoon in D Company in this action. 50 yards in, the company came under heavy machine gun fire from the German offensive. It was in this exchange of fire that Lieutenant Donald Wallace Moffett was killed in action, 3 days after his 23rd birthday. Moffett is buried in the Casino War Cemetery in Italy, along with 39 members of his regiment. We will remember them.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Please now welcome Caitlin Steva, who will share the biographies of father and son, James and Arthur Eatman, Black Canadian soldiers from Fredericton who served in the First and Second World Wars, respectively. Caitlin comes from Fredericton. They are in their final year of a Doctor of Philosophy and History and plan on continuing their career in academia as a postdoctoral researcher. Welcome, Caitlin.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you for being here with us today. So this morning I would like to share with you the stories of two extraordinary men who have come to mean quite a bit to me over the last couple of years of my research. As has been noted, my research focuses on the experience of Black Canadians in the Canadian military in the First and Second World War and the policies that governed their wartime service. During the First World War, there were no policies preventing Black Canadians from enlisting in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. But commanding officers across this province and across this nation routinely denied Black volunteers the opportunity to enlist. As one of the greatest and deadliest conflicts unfolded on the battlefields of Europe, Black Canadians were told, "Go home, we don't want you," simply because of the color of their skin. And only a few commanding officers across this nation were willing to accept their service. Among those Black volunteers who did find a home in the unit was James Eatman. Born in 1882 in Elm Hill, so just down the road from here, James eventually settled here in Fredericton, where he lived on Charlotte Street with his wife Teresa and their 6 children. James enlisted at the tail end of 1915. One of only a handful of Black men in his unit, James sailed to England with the 140th Battalion in October 1916. But like many of the units arriving in England at that time, the 104th Battalion was dissolved, and its members distributed to various depots to be used as reinforcements for infantry units already fighting in France. James would eventually join one of those infantry units in France. He was called to join the 25th Battalion in March of 1917, and he had his first days of combat at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, as he and the rest of the 25th fought their way up the slopes of that now iconic battlefield. Injured during the summer of 1917, James rejoined his unit in time for the quick jaunt up to Ypres in October of 1917 for the Battle of Passchendaele. Amid the mud and the muck of that hellish battlefield, a bullet with James' names on it finally found its mark. Suffering originally a gunshot wound to his right shoulder, he would also sustain shrapnel wounds to his upper back and his head as he made his way first to a casualty clearing station, then to a field ambulance, and finally being evacuated to England for further medical treatment. His time on the battlefield had come to an end, but his service would continue. After convalescing for several months, James was assigned to the Canadian Specialty Hospital at Etching Hill, where he worked as a general laborer and orderly for the remainder of the war. He was demobilized in July 1919, and once again rejoined his family in their home on Charlotte Street. But that's not where James's story ends. A little over 10 months after he returned home, he and Teresa welcomed another baby, a little boy they named Arthur Wallace Eatman. Arthur grew up loving sports. He was athletic, and the stories from those who knew him recount how he was always captaining his teams at recess and he was well loved by his classmates. Those stories also tell us of how Arthur earned himself a nickname, Duke. Duke left school after completing grade 7, opting instead to support his family by working one of the local lumbering mills here in Fredericton. And he was still working at the same mill in 1939 when Canada once again found itself at war. Like his father, Duke enlisted early. He joined the Carleton and York Regiment on September 3, 1939, at a mere 19 years of age. Once they arrived in England, the Carleton and York Regiment spent a lot of time waiting and training. Duke, however, put all that time to good use and sought to improve his skills as both a soldier and a leader. His hard work paid off, and by October 1942, he had reached the rank of sergeant. After spending a little over 3 years in England, the Carleton and York Regiment, along with the rest of the 1st Canadian Division, were finally given the opportunity to join the fight. They were off to the Mediterranean theater, where they joined the Allied invasion of Sicily during the summer of 1943. For the sake of time, I won't detail the events of the regiment's first few weeks there, but rather bring you to the night of July 22nd. As the Carleton and York Regiment took up position in the Detana River Valley, Duke was tasked with leading a patrol to ascertain the location of enemy positions. Duke, along with 28 other men, all under his command, set out, but that patrol was never to return. The exact events of that night remain a mystery, but most believe that somewhere along the way they encountered a German patrol. In the ensuing fight, Duke, along with 4 other men, were killed, and their bodies were eventually recovered the next day by other members of the Carleton and York Regiment. The remainder of the platoon was taken as prisoners of war. Duke, along with the others who fell during that patrol, now rest together in the slopes of the Agira Canadian War Cemetery, overlooking the valley below. The story of James and Duke are special in the way that the story of every single soldier is special. They tell of an individual who recognized a cause greater than themselves, a cause they felt worthy enough to give their lives to. But for James and Duke and other Black Canadians, there's more to that story. They lived at a time when racial segregation and discrimination were not only permissible, but in many cases were encouraged by individuals and institutions alike. And that includes our community here at UNB. James and Duke did more than just sign up to fight a war. They signed up to fight a war not knowing if their service would be accepted, if their comrades would trust them, if others would want them to lead, or if their service would be recognized and their sacrifices remembered. As we approach Remembrance Day, I encourage each of you to take the time to consider what it means to remember men like James and Duke. Not just their wartime contributions, but the families they left behind, the lives they had outside of uniform, and the legacies they leave behind for us to remember, and we will remember them.
Thank you, Caitlin. The ritual of reflecting on and remembering those who served and died in conflict is a powerful way of keeping their memories and sacrifices alive. In addition to honoring the sacrifices of those who died in war, we must also acknowledge and work to understand its complexities and the varying impacts it has on all of our communities. It is now my honor to invite Todd Ross, Indigenous Advisor at UNB, to share his reflections on the impact of war and conflict on our communities and people. Todd?
Need Wabanakpat Nedishnakaz, Bigazine Nodum, Duck Lake, Unjabadankamis. Introduce myself, my spirit name, Wabanakpat. I'm Eagle Clan, and my grandmother comes from Duck Lake in Saskatchewan, Red River Métis, and a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. I'd like to start by thanking the Grand Chief for your opening and for the pipe ceremony to start us off today. I want to talk about my service. I grew up not far from here in rural New Brunswick, in just outside St. Stephen. At the age of 12, I joined the Army Cadets, and remember those early days going to the Cenotaph, November 11th, with all of the veterans who would come out, and it seemed like there were so many back then in the early 80s. And after the care that they would take, so as we as young cadets would go up to the Legion, and simple things like they taught us how to put our berets in the pool pockets so we didn't have to pay to play pool, how they took care of us. At the age of 18, after I graduated high school, I joined the Canadian Armed Forces, signed up. I was quickly accepted into the Navy and became a Naval Combat Information Operator. Did my trades training. I was posted to the HMCS Saskatchewan on the West Coast. I had been in for about a year when 2 people showed up on the ship, pulled me off the ship, and what began an 18-month interrogation started. So I was told at the time that I was being interrogated espionage. I was questioned about my loyalty to the country, and I was questioned about my sexuality. During that time, the people on my ship were tremendous allies. They were very supportive. I never disclosed the fact that I was being interrogated about being gay because I hadn't come out to myself. So when I did come out, it took me 20 years to come out, and I came out to the military, to two guys in a suit in a room under interrogation. At that time, I was offered an honorable discharge, or I could spend the next 6 months serving, sweeping streets, and doing general labor. So I took the honorable discharge, but I didn't feel any honor at the time. It took me another 20 years to admit that I was a veteran. When I was released, I was told that I was not a veteran, that I would never apply, or I would never receive veteran services. And so 20 years later, it was a Métis elder who called me up and said he was a veteran as well, and lectured me on the fact that I served my country and I was a veteran, and to start acknowledging that I was a veteran. So that's when I started to acknowledge that I was a veteran. 7 years ago, yesterday, due to some circumstances that just happened to be in the place at the time, I filed a class action, or rather my lawyers filed a class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada for people who are employed in the civil service, the federal civil service, who face discrimination, harassment. So for the thousands of people who were fired from their jobs, who were interrogated simply because of who they love, simply because they were part of the 2S LGBTQI+ community. That class action lawsuit was then expanded into the federal court. It became the three of us joined together, 3 separate class action lawsuits. And in November of 2017, just over a year after that, we met for the first time, a group of dozens of veterans who had served, LGBT veterans, met for the first time. And it was the first time we had that understanding that we weren't alone, that so many others had served and had had their service cut short because of who they were. Since that time, we've had the apology from the Prime Minister, the class action lawsuit has been settled, and we've heard the stories of so many who didn't survive, of veterans from the 1950s to the 1990s, when this interrogation, when this hunt occurred within the Canadian Armed Forces, within the Federal Civil Service, the RCMP. So my story was a bit by accident, that I ended up being the person whose name was on the class action suit. But since that time, I've met so many wonderful people, and I've heard the stories of so many wonderful people who served even before that. So people like Frederick Hardy, whose name is on the Vimy Memorial, who died at the age of 19 and spent 8 months in prison just because he was gay. So I wanted to share that with you a bit today. Of course, we remember the sacrifices of all those who served, those and the families and the harm that was done. But this story hasn't been told very often about the 2S LGBTQI+ community, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you today. Marcy.
Thank you, Todd, for sharing your story with us today. I now invite trumpeter Matthew Daly to perform the last post. can all be seated now.
Thank you.
In honor of those who have faced the horrors of war and conflict, past and present, we will now proceed with the laying of the wreaths. In Fredericton, we will lay the following wreaths. A wreath is laid on behalf of the Professional and Technical Staff Union, Local 60551, in memory of all who have served. Our friends and colleagues in the College of Extended Learning lay a wreath in memory of all who have served. From the UNB's The 203 Center for Gender and Sexual Diversity in honor of LGBTQIA2S+ veterans and survivors of the purge of queer service members in the Canadian Armed Forces, RCMP, and Federal Public Service. From the UNB Art Center, which is housed here in Memorial Hall on the Fredericton campus, a memorial to UNBers who served in the First World War. A wreath is laid from the Craig Center for the Study of War and Society. A wreath is laid on behalf of the Faculty of Nursing in honor of the many of nurses who served in our wars. And a wreath from Unifor Local 4504 and from the College of Extended Learning. On our St. John campus, a wreath is laid on behalf of people and culture in remembrance of UNB employees called to service. A wreath is laid on behalf of the UNB Associated Alumni and the more than 99,000 UNB alumni around the world in honor of all affected by war, past and present. From Strategic Communications and Marketing, on behalf of all service people, and a wreath from QP 3339. Thank you to everyone for laying these wreaths of honor and for remembering. I would now like to take this opportunity to invite Grand Chief Tremblay to lead us in a moment of silence, followed by closing prayer.
Before we have a moment of silence, I'd like to share a story that my dad shared with me when he came to Fredericton at the compound here to train. His roommate was, I don't know if maybe the older generation know this name, but his roommate was Hank Snow, which was an old country western singer. And my dad was only 16 years old. He lied because many of the people in our community, the men lied because they wanted 3 square meals a day and a place to stay and a place to sleep, because during that time our community was in great depression. So Hank Snow would sing to the men at night, and we'd all be crying because he'd sing these really sad songs, missing home. And he said once he got to England, and he was a truck driver. And they would transport the soldiers at night, and they weren't allowed to turn their lights on the trucks. So my dad, unfortunately, was the lead truck, and he crashed the truck, and he got hurt. So he had to come home, and one of his best buddies was dating a young woman called Doris Sapir at the time. He said, "Go back home and take care of Doris, Ray." Well, he sure did. That became my mom. She became Doris Trombley. And the man who was my dad's friend brought home a wonderful war bride, Jean, who was a member of our community, who spoke our language fluently. She had to learn, because back then our people just spoke our language. So, and I just want to dedicate this short time to all the women who stayed back home to maintain the communities, their homes, and they sacrificed a lot too. Our mothers, our grandmothers, and all those wonderful, the women who stayed back home. So I want to have a moment of silence now. Then I'll close with a song. It's a lullaby for the ones who had passed. It's the ones who had passed, and to help them on their journeys home to the spirit world. Before I share the chant, I want to explain a little bit about the cedar that's laid down here. Cedar is a medicine that we use to help to cleanse and to heal. And we have used the cedar from the cedar tree many, since the beginning of time. And the cedar is a feminine medicine that the women carry the cedar for us, and the water, where us men are responsible for the sacred fires that we burn and the tobacco that we burn to offer. So thank you, Todd, for collecting the cedar for us. So this song dedicated to the ones who have passed.
Oh
Thank you, Grand Chief Tremblay, and thank you also to everyone who helped bring this morning's ceremony to life. Thanks to each of you for joining us today and our colleagues in St. John as well. And a special thank you to the Ladies Auxiliary of Fredericton Branch 4 of the Royal Canadian Legion. I now invite everyone to gather in the lobby for refreshments and further reflections. Thank you for joining us.